Read that headline again, because the most important word in it is not Iran and it is not Bahrain. It is water. Bahrain says an Iranian drone strike damaged a desalination plant, causing material damage and knocking part of that water infrastructure offline. In most countries, damage to one utility site is a serious local story. In the Gulf, it is something else entirely. It is a warning about how modern life in this region actually works. Strip away the skylines, the ports, the refineries, the financial districts, the airports, the towers, the malls, the military bases, and underneath all of it is one basic reality. In much of the Gulf, fresh water does not simply come out of the ground in the quantities modern cities need. It has to be manufactured. It has to be pumped from the sea, processed, stored, distributed, and protected every hour of every day. That is why this story matters so much. A strike on oil changes prices. A strike on water changes daily life. And that is also why this has to be covered carefully. There's a lot of noise, propaganda, panic, and emotional language surrounding this war. So let's stay disciplined and stick to what is actually verified. Bahraini authorities said an Iranian drone hit a desalination plant and caused material damage. Associated Press also reported that Bahrain accused Iran of striking the plant. Bahrain has additionally reported injuries from falling fragments elsewhere. What remains less clear, at least publicly right now, is the full scale of the disruption, how long the facility will stay offline, and exactly how much spare capacity Bahrain can immediately move into place. Those unanswered questions are the difference between a contained infrastructure incident and a broader civilian emergency. But even before those answers are fully public, the strategic meaning is already obvious. Bahrain is one of the Gulf states where desalination is not a luxury add-on. It is core national infrastructure. Bahraini official and government-linked sources describe desalination as central to potable water supply, with desalination plants fulfilling nearly all municipal water requirements. That means this is not a side utility. It is part of the system that keeps homes supplied, hospitals functioning, schools open, businesses running, and public confidence intact. So when a desalination plant is damaged, the first question is not whether people panic today. The first question is whether the system around that plant is resilient enough to absorb the hit. That is the real story here. Not cinematic language, not shock thumbnails, not the kind of exaggerated script that treats every strike like the end of the world. The real story is resilience under stress. How much redundancy does Bahrain have? How fast can damaged capacity be replaced with output from other plants, storage reserves, mobile units, imports, or rerouted supply? How much of the plant is offline? Was the damage to intake infrastructure, pumping, power, membranes, storage, or a peripheral support system? If you know infrastructure, you know those are not small details. They determine whether disruption lasts hours, days, or longer. And once you understand that, you see why this attack hits differently from a strike on a symbolic building. Water infrastructure is not just politically sensitive, it is operationally sensitive. It creates pressure quietly, then all at once. Most people do not notice how dependent they are on a desalination network until the network falters. The tap still works right up until it does not. The city still feels normal right up until restrictions begin. That is why the attack on a desalination plant carries a different psychological charge from a strike on an airbase or a refinery. Oil is global and tradable. Water is local and immediate. If a refinery goes down, the economic effects may be enormous, but they often move through prices, shipping, and industry. If water infrastructure is impaired, the effect moves through kitchens, bathrooms, hospitals, schools, and human routine. It becomes intimate very fast. This is also why smaller Gulf states face a uniquely difficult problem in this war. Large states can sometimes hide stress inside scale. A country with a wider geography, more plants, more reserve capacity, and more internal distribution options can sometimes spread the damage. Smaller states have less room for error. The margin between disruption and public anxiety can be much thinner. That does not automatically mean Bahrain is now facing a national water crisis. It means the risk profile has changed. And it has changed in a way every government in the region will understand immediately. Because once a desalination plant is hit, a line has been crossed. Civilian water infrastructure is no longer theoretical collateral risk. It is now part of the real conversation about what may be targeted, what must be defended, and what populations may fear next. That matters beyond Bahrain. The Gulf runs on infrastructure webs that are efficient, advanced, and highly concentrated. Airports, data centers, ports, power stations, gas processing, desalination, and military logistics often sit in a relatively compressed geographic space. That concentration helps create modern prosperity. It can also create vulnerability when a conflict starts reaching across borders with drones and missiles. And this is where the story becomes bigger than one plant. If attacks on desalination continue, governments are forced into a new hierarchy of priorities. Not public relations, not prestige, not rhetoric, water, electricity, shelter, hospitals, air defense, continuity of supply. The language of national security starts sounding a lot more like the language of civil defense, because that is what happens when a state must protect not only its sovereignty or its bases, but the systems that keep civilian life ordinary. Think about what desalination actually requires: coastal access, intake systems, energy, treatment capacity, storage, distribution networks, skilled operators, chemicals, maintenance, security. Every one of those is a potential point of fragility under sustained conflict. And even when a strike causes only material damage, that phrase can hide serious operational consequences. Material damage can mean visible destruction. It can also mean enough impairment to reduce output, trigger precautionary shutdowns, or force emergency redistribution. So a careful analyst should resist two bad habits at once. The first is minimizing the event because the full system has not collapsed. The second is exaggerating the event into an immediate humanitarian catastrophe before the evidence supports that conclusion. The serious middle ground is this: a desalination strike in Bahrain is a strategically significant warning sign, because Bahrain depends heavily on desalinated water, and because water infrastructure is among the most sensitive civilian systems in any conflict. There's another layer here that makes this even more consequential. Desalination is linked to power. In many Gulf systems, water and electricity planning are tightly intertwined. That means a strike on water infrastructure is never only about water. It raises questions about grid support, backup generation, distribution loads, maintenance access, and whether multiple utility stresses could compound one another. A government may be able to manage one hit. Managing overlapping hits is a different challenge. And once populations start realizing that, the meaning of every alert changes. People no longer hear sirens and think only about military targets. They start thinking about water storage, supermarket shelves, ATMs, fuel queues, school closures, and whether relatives in another district are affected differently from them. That shift in public psychology matters. It is how wars spread beyond the battlefield into the routine calculations of ordinary households. This is why policy-safe, fact-safe storytelling matters too. A lot of content creators ruin credibility right here. They take a real event and force it into totalizing language. Everything is collapsing. There is no defense left. Society ends in days. That kind of script may spike emotion, but it also drifts away from evidence. And that is exactly how channels end up feeding misinformation, panic, or deceptive framing. The truth is strong enough on its own. Bahrain says a desalination plant was hit. Bahrain relies heavily on desalination. Water infrastructure is among the most strategically sensitive civilian systems in the Gulf. That is already a major story, and if you want to understand why, zoom out. The Gulf has always been discussed through oil. But the deeper modern miracle was never just extracting hydrocarbons. It was using energy wealth to defeat water scarcity at scale. Desalination helped make urban growth, industry tourism, and dense modern life possible in places where natural freshwater is limited. In that sense, desalination is not auxiliary infrastructure. It is foundational infrastructure. It is part of how these states turned geography into viability. So an attack on desalination is an attack on that model of viability. Again, that does not mean Bahrain suddenly has no water. It means the conflict has touched one of the systems that makes normal life possible, and that carries a signal every Gulf capital can read instantly. What comes next will depend on three things. First, repair speed. If the damaged components are limited and Bahrain can restore or replace lost capacity quickly, the incident may remain serious but contained. Fast repair, reserve drawdown, and rerouted output can stabilize public confidence. Second, redundancy. If Bahrain has enough alternate production and storage to absorb the outage without visible service degradation, then the strategic message of the strike may ultimately be larger than the practical disruption. That is still important because it affects future threat calculations, but it is different from a broad civilian shortage. Third, repetition. One strike can be managed. Repeated strikes are a different category. Repetition changes the mathematics of resilience. It stretches maintenance, security, staffing, and public patience. It also forces governments to defend a growing target set over time. That third point may be the most important of all. Modern infrastructure can survive damage. What becomes harder to survive is uncertainty. If operators do not know which system is next, if governments must harden everything at once, if insurers, contractors, and outside technical partners begin recalculating risk, then even a country that avoids immediate service collapse can still face rising stress and cost across the whole utility chain. And that brings us to the human layer. The people most affected by utility insecurity are rarely the people who chose the war. It is families, nurses finishing a late shift, parents filling kettles before school, elderly people who depend on stable home conditions, hospital administrators reviewing backup systems, apartment residents who may not know whether what they are hearing online is true or exaggerated. In every war, there is a moment when infrastructure stories stop sounding technical and start sounding personal. A desalination plant being hit is one of those moments. It also sharpens the legal and moral debate around civilian infrastructure. Water systems sit near the core of humanitarian concern because they are so directly tied to civilian welfare. Even where governments argue over military logic, retaliation, deterrence, or responsibility, the public instinct around water is different. People understand immediately that water is not abstract. You can politicize a lot of things. You cannot easily depoliticize thirst. That is why this incident may carry more political force regionally than some strikes that were financially larger. It is one thing for markets to react to energy risk. It is another for populations to imagine water vulnerability in real time. For Bahrain's leadership, the challenge now is not only technical, it is informational. Citizens need clarity without panic. They need confidence that contingencies exist. They need to know whether the disruption is partial, temporary, or likely to affect household supply. In crises like this, credibility becomes infrastructure too. If governments communicate clearly, they preserve trust. If information gaps fill up with rumors, the social effects can widen faster than the physical damage. For the wider Gulf, the lesson is equally clear. Water resilience is now part of national defense planning in a more visible way than ever before. Hardening plants, expanding storage, dispersing critical components, improving backup power, strengthening cyber and physical protection, and creating faster repair pathways all move from technical planning documents into urgent strategic priorities. And for viewers trying to understand the bigger picture, here is the simplest way to frame it. This story is not just about a drone hitting a facility. It is about a conflict moving closer to the infrastructure of civilian life. That is the shift. When wars expand, they often stop being measured only in front lines and start being measured in systems under strain. Airports, shipping lanes, energy, communications, water. Once water enters that list, the stakes feel different because they are different. So no, the responsible takeaway is not everything is over. The responsible takeaway is that one of the most sensitive categories of civilian infrastructure in one of the world's most water-stressed regions has now been directly affected, according to Bahraini authorities, and that should concern anyone who wants de-escalation, realism, and honest analysis. Because the real danger in moments like this is not just destruction. It is normalization. If the world starts treating desalination strikes as another headline in a fast-moving war feed, then the threshold for what counts as acceptable damage keeps drifting. And history shows that once that drift begins, civilians pay for it first. So watch what officials say next. Watch whether Bahrain reports stable service, emergency adjustments, or broader disruption. Watch whether repairs move quickly. Watch whether other Gulf states accelerate visible protection around water and power assets. And above all, watch whether this remains a single alarming incident or becomes part of a repeat pattern. That distinction will tell you more about where this conflict is heading than a dozen dramatic monologues ever could. Because in the end, the real headline is not just that a plant was hit. It is that a modern state built on engineered water security has just been reminded in public that the systems making daily life possible can be placed inside the crosshairs of war. And once water is in the crosshairs, every city in the region has to think differently. Not just about retaliation, not just about deterrence, about resilience, about how many days of storage exist behind the confidence of normal life, about how quickly a government can replace damaged output, about whether critical infrastructure is concentrated too tightly, about whether the next strike is absorbed quietly or felt in every home. That is why this story matters. Not because panic helps. It does not. Not because exaggeration is useful. It is not. It matters because water is the invisible foundation of modern Gulf stability, and Bahrain says that foundation has now been directly tested. The next phase of this story will not be written only in military briefings. It will be written in repair crews, reserve calculations, public statements, and whether people can still turn on a tap tomorrow and trust what comes out. That is the line to watch now. Not the loudest claim, the water. There is a reason analysts have been warning for years that in the Gulf, water may be even more sensitive than oil in a prolonged regional conflict. Oil disruption hurts economies, trade balances, manufacturing, and inflation. Water disruption threatens continuity of life itself. You can delay a purchase. You cannot indefinitely delay water use. Cities can conserve fuel. Hospitals, households, sanitation networks, and emergency services still need dependable water every day. That is why even a limited strike on desalination infrastructure commands attention far beyond the immediate site. And there is a hard geographic reality underneath all of this. The Gulf is one of the most water-stressed regions on Earth. Natural freshwater is limited, groundwater is under pressure, and urban concentration has pushed states toward large-scale engineered solutions. Desalination helped solve that problem, but every solution creates its own dependency. The more successful desalination becomes, the more central it becomes to national stability. Success creates reliance. Reliance creates exposure. That is not an argument against desalination. It is an argument for understanding what kind of infrastructure it really is. A desalination plant is not just industrial hardware on a coastline. IT is a converter of geography into habitability. It takes a place where natural water constraints are severe and helps make dense urban life possible. Which means, when it is threatened, what is threatened is not only output in cubic meters. What is threatened is confidence in the continuity of normal life. You can already see why this topic demands a calm voice instead of a theatrical one. The facts are serious enough. AP described the strike as stoking fears of attacks on civilian sites. Bahraini authorities said the plant suffered material damage. Government-linked information from Bahrain makes clear that desalination meets nearly all municipal water requirements. And broader reporting has underscored how heavily smaller Gulf states depend on desalinated supply. Put those facts together, and you do not need to invent drama. The seriousness is already there. Another reason to watch this carefully is that infrastructure attacks can create delayed effects. The public often imagines crises as instant collapse. Real utility stress can look different. Day one may be manageable because storage, rerouting, and reserve capacity help smooth the shock. Day 2 and Day 3 may reveal whether the outage is actually contained. Maintenance teams may discover damage is broader than first thought, or conversely, that it is more repairable than feared. That is why the most important updates in the next news cycle may not be the most dramatic ones. They may be the mundane ones. Restoration timelines, service advisories, pressure levels, conservation requests, tanker support, and repair milestones. In other words, the truth of this story may emerge through operations, not rhetoric. There's also an international audience that should pay attention here. Outside the region, desalination can sound like specialized infrastructure, almost niche. In the Gulf, it is ordinary life, and that gap in understanding matters. If global audiences do not grasp what desalination means in Bahrain, they may underestimate why this strike has such symbolic and practical weight. Imagine if a major city elsewhere saw a core drinking water treatment facility damaged in wartime. The reaction would be immediate. That same seriousness applies here. This is also one of those moments that tests whether governments and media can separate verified fact from strategic storytelling. In war, every side pushes narratives. One side emphasizes resolve, another emphasizes victimhood, another emphasizes deterrence, another tries to shape international opinion. The public sees clips, claims, maps, and dramatic summaries, but infrastructure analysis forces discipline. Either the plant was damaged or it was not. Either capacity was reduced or it was not. Either service continuity is holding or it is not. Those are measurable realities, and over time they cut through propaganda better than slogans do. And that is why viewers should be cautious with any absolute claim they hear over the next day or two. If someone says this changes nothing, that is too dismissive. If someone says Bahrain is instantly out of water, that is too extreme unless hard evidence appears. Serious analysis stays in the uncomfortable middle, where evidence leads and emotion follows, not the other way around. The policy lesson may end up being just as important as the military lesson. For years, Gulf resilience planning has had to think about energy security, missile defense, cyber risk, and maritime choke points. Now, water resilience sits even more visibly in that same conversation. Reserve tanks, distributed production, physical hardening, rapid repair contracts, spare components, decentralized systems, and public communication plans all become more than technical details. They become instruments of national stability. And there is a final point that should not be missed. When civilian infrastructure becomes part of the target environment, escalation becomes easier to start and harder to contain. Why? Because the effects spread in ways that military planning cannot fully box in. A strike on water infrastructure can generate public fear, international criticism, emergency policy responses, and reciprocal pressure all at once. It widens the war's footprint even if the blast radius itself is limited. So, if you want the clearest possible summary, here it is. Bahrain says an Iranian drone damaged a desalination plant. That matters because desalination is central to Bahrain's municipal water supply. The full operational impact is not yet publicly clear, but the strategic significance is already clear. A conflict that had already touched energy, aviation, and other infrastructure has now, according to Bahraini authorities, directly touched water. In a region built on desalinated water, that is not a side note. It is one of the clearest signs yet that the infrastructure of civilian normalcy is under pressure. And that is why the smartest way to watch this story is not through panic and not through denial. Watch the system, watch the repairs, watch the reserves, watch whether normal service holds. Because when the subject is water, the difference between a warning shot and a wider civilian crisis is measured not by the loudness of the explosion, but by the quiet resilience of everything that has to keep working after it. Word count, 3,500 fact-check basis used for the script. Bahrain's Interior Ministry said an Iranian drone caused material damage to a desalination plant, and AP separately reported Bahrain accused Iran of striking the plant. The same day's reporting also noted ongoing cross-border missile and drone activity in the Gulf. Bahrain's dependence on desalination is a key reason the script frames this as strategically serious, but avoids unsupported claims of immediate nationwide collapse. Bahrain government-linked sources say the kingdom meets potable and municipal water needs through desalination, with several plants fulfilling nearly all municipal requirements. Reporting on the wider regional context also supports the script's focus on water vulnerability rather than sensational certainty. AP and WSJ coverage emphasize that desalination is critical in the Gulf, and especially sensitive for smaller states such as Bahrain and Kuwait.